And with that, I call on Lucas Bretschger, who's the director of the Center of Economic Research in Zurich, to give us a broad economic grounding in some of the principles of climate mitigation strategy, economic principles, really. Sorry, I should say, just again, for clarity's sake, Lucas will speak for about 20 minutes. You will then have 10 minutes to come up with your best comments and questions. So get your thinking caps on. Thank you.
Well, waiting for the slides. All right, maybe when I'm here already, good afternoon. Thank you, James, for the introduction. I could already talk about the title a little bit, maybe, because the title was actually given to me, and I like it very much. So it is about effective policies against climate change. So I should probably explain first what I, think about effective policy. What is that? So I think effective policy has to be pragmatic on one hand, but it also has to be somehow idealistic. It has to have the aim at an optimum or an ideal perspective of the world. So the pragmatic foundation of a policy was to focus on the preparation phase of this COP. This was mainly about participation of many, many countries, and we are now pleased to see that many countries already made the pledges and already kind of participating in the whole process. But I guess an optimum policy would be more consistent on a global level. And it should increasingly become the guideline for negotiations and for the future review of the progress. So my plan was first, if my slides will arrive, to talk about the consistent global climate policy, and then speak about possible momentum which can move the process into such a direction.
I am very sorry. I already called the technician, but...
Okay, maybe I can start, maybe you can, it's a good exercise without slides, right? So you have to be very careful to listen to me. So I guess, when I talk about this ideal policy, I think, or what you also could say, a good climate policy, it should be both efficient and equitable. So this is actually, these are the two things that will go through my talk, efficiency and equity. And I think it's the duty of the economists to disentangle the two things very carefully, because in politics it's often mixed up. On the one hand, efficiency is crucial because we want to achieve a climate target. And this climate target has to be achieved at lowest economic cost. So this is actually a main core contribution of economics. How can we do this at minimum cost for the economy? And you might recall that the instruments that have been proposed to obtain this, on the one hand, are uniform carbon price, a world carbon price, and on the other hand, it can also be an emission trading system with international links. So if I go maybe and extend a bit on this first part, just to have a basic environmental economics lecture here, you can either give a price to a thing which has an external cost, and then you limit the quantity because this thing hadn't have a price before, or you can limit the quantity and let the market decide on what the price is. I found out in my work with the delegations and in my policy advice work, it's much easier to talk about carbon budgets because this is some kind relating to natural sciences. There is a limited carbon budget available up to 2050, say, or 2100. And then you think about how you can allocate this carbon budget to the single countries. And in fact, it is something like a carbon price which emerges, but in fact, you talk about quantities. It's also something that is very appealing to policy. Okay, so now if I do, kind of, you see my first slide already. That's not too bad. Okay, we'll be soon there. So this was efficiency. And what I would argue is that equity is now really more important to start with. because we talk about burden sharing. Equity is really important because a burden sharing has considered to be fair. And if it's not fair, it will not be well received by policy. So for example, if you recall Kyoto, which was already mentioned, what was the problem with the acceptance of the agreement? That it was not equitable, that not all the major emitters were involved in a meaningful way. Equity is also important to raise the ambitions to reach the temperature target, which is really what we want. Okay, much better now. Thank you. So now we are full speed. You see, the efficiency and now the equity. I also argue that equity is important to give you some guidelines for the evaluation of the current pledges. So now that the pledges are in, how should we know how ambitious these pledges are? You have to compare them. How do they contribute to each other? And this is how we can use equity. And I will show you in a minute how this is done. So it is also important to know that if you say, I'm in favor of a tax, or I'm in favor of equal access to carbon space, this of course also has an equity implication. In general, distribution has a dominant meaning in policy. It's a dominant topic. Climate change is especially dominant in this respect, because climate change and climate policies both have a major distributional impact. It is well known that without a policy, less developed and vulnerable countries will suffer disproportionately. And with a stringent climate policy, carbon-intensive countries expect a substantial policy burden. When we come to the country level, what are the costs on the country level? Then we should say, well, the carbon prices are not the only price that the people face, and not the only burden that they have to carry. The climate policy should be part of a fair system, of an overall system. So many things have an effect on income distribution, but of course there are other instruments available to affect income distribution as well. Talking about climate policy cost, various governments and firms are concerned about high climate policy cost. And here I think recent results of economic research are useful, because overall climate policy costs are moderated by different issues. First of all, economic dynamics. Decision makers tend to focus on the short run. They tend to underrate induced innovation and new dynamics. Of course, the shifts which are required, they need some changes in flexibility. Second point is uncertainty. Uncertainty often induces inactivity, but that is not a rational response, because we are all risk averse. A rational response to uncertainty is to reduce uncertainty, that is, to do more climate mitigation than you would do with certainty. And the third part which moderates the costs are the secondary benefits of climate policy. They arise in the fields of health, regional environment, induced innovation, higher employment. These are especially rewarding for emerging economies. Maybe you have seen recent pictures of China, of Beijing. You see what the regional air pollution is doing there. When we talk about country policy cost, then these costs which are on the country level are also affected by the international burden sharing. How much does each country have to contribute? Now, an ideal metric for allocating this burden sharing is of course fair. This is what I'm going to explain. But it also should be simple. It should be comprehensive, measurable, replicable, and universal. Now, according to the convention, we have to build on CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. CBDR, how do we do this and how can we make it operational? We do it best by using focal points. These are general principles which are part of everybody's general expectations. These are suitable to build acceptance, trust among the negotiation partners. In the context of fairness, we want to focus on the equity principles. And why? Well, for equity principles, a common understanding already exists. They are broadly implemented already in national public policies. For example, in tax and transfer schemes. So these are the 4 equity principles that I would like to refer to. The first is the ability to pay. The larger the economic capacity of a country, the more it should contribute to global climate policy, very much like national tax policies. Second, for a pragmatic policy, also policy cost sharing. Policy is imposing a cost on countries. So the lower a country's cost of the policy, the more it should contribute, and vice versa. The third one is the merit principle. The bigger the effort of a country to solve the underlying problem, the higher is its merit, the more it should be rewarded. The more it should contribute, it contributes to technical contribution, it should have a higher carbon budget. And finally, and this goes back to Aristotle, is comparing like with like. We should have tons of CO2 emitted compared to tons of CO2 emitted on the fair conditions. So I argue when you have abundant alternative energy sources, then the tons of CO2 emitted should be weighted differently than from times when you have no alternative energy sources. Now these 4 equity principles can be used to frame an equity-based burden sharing. The weights can still be chosen. If you don't like one of those, you can set it to 0. You can say, for me, ability to pay is the most dominant one. I want to have it 80%, and the other ones are just for 10% and for 0. Whatever you want, you like, you would think it's fair. Equal weights, in my view, are obvious and a very reasonable choice. If you choose, for example, a uniform carbon tax or equal access to carbon space, this is also compatible with this approach, and so it's a very extreme weight that you give to its different principles. Now, some have said it has not worked previously, the one with the equity principle, because Kyoto was they also tried these things before. But let us be fair, not so much has worked previously. And this has worked with many other policies. And what we propose now is a much more refined and flexible procedure than what was tried at Kyoto, for example. And we still have some time. We will still have some time to go into the review phase, so we have some time to have this accepted by parties. So for each of these proposals, for the equity-based proposal and also for the uniform global carbon tax, which was also proposed, or for the egalitarian carbon budget per capita, we can compare the three for a certain country, and then we can also compare it to the current mitigation pledges, the INDCs. In general, the scheme looks like this. You see the 3 different proposals that are on the table, or say the 3 net proposals that are there. You see on the horizontal axis carbon emissions per capita, on the horizontal axis the country carbon budget, what you get out of the total cake. You see that with the uniform carbon tax, the higher emitters get a higher budget. This is like grandfathering. For the egalitarian allocation of carbon space, you have no dependence of the country carbon budget on the carbon emissions per capita, that's the red line. While the equity-based criterion, which I'm proposing, is actually compromise. And I think in the end, in politics, you would need a compromise to find a solution in the end. If you want to do this thing specifically for several countries, for specific countries, you can do it with this Eth Climate Calculator, ccalc ethz.ca. Everybody can try this. On the left-hand side, you can choose several parameters. You can choose a medium strict or a very strict climate target. You can say how many countries you want to include in the final negotiation, maybe all of them. Then you can have weights for the different equity principles. You see it on the left. There is a default, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, but you can also shift this. And then you can also choose how much of the previous emissions, of the past emissions, should be accounted for. You can give a discount of 50%, you can say now 100% historic responsibility. And with this, you can then compare what for the different countries would result as a carbon budget, and then you can see whether we do this equity-based criterion, or we do a tax proposal, or we do egalitarian access to carbon space, what the countries should provide for complying to these policies. This is just one of the examples. If you do this climate calculator, it's just any country. You see how this is done. You see the past development, historic development, and the baseline, how it would go without a policy. And then you see how this development path of the CO2 per capita should look like. This is now an equity-based, this is the blue one, but you can also do it for the red one of the green one. And you see the current pledges, and you see some gap there. So this is like the UNEP gap report. You can calculate how much the gap is, but you can do it for each country, and you can see for which principle the gap is biggest. And probably some countries have no gap with certain principles, but other countries have gaps with all the principles, and then this would be a hint for action. Now this calculator, which you probably want to try yourself, hopefully you will do this, this has kind of a top-down perspective. And what we're currently doing is more like bottom-up. So as I started in the beginning, when the slides were not there, you probably didn't pay too much attention. What we're doing now is we collect individual contributions, country contributions. The positive thing about the bottom-up is that country confirm this commitment. So they try to say, well, what is feasible for them? Also positive for the individual countries, they form these contributions on a broad heading of national circumstances. They have all kind of ideas what is feasible at in their home base and what is not feasible. But one, there's two buts, there's big buts. But one is the overall level of ambitions is not sufficient, as we know. And the second one is that the fairness of the international agreement is not given at the moment. It's very, it's not in equilibrium, it's not equitable. So there is an acceptance problem, probably, maybe it's also coming later, that later countries find out that they're doing much more than other countries, so that they will not likely be signing the agreement. What I'm proposing here with the climate equity calculator is not really top-down. It's something like a consistent bottom-up, I would call it. It's like an ideal future policy. It's a global fair metric. It's more durable because it's equitable. And the emissions are sufficient because I'm already handing out the carbon budget that I really want to have in the end to reach the 2 degrees Celsius target. The problem with it, of course, is the national commitments, which are not there. We are not yet there. And it is not that we can consider all these national circumstances a country would like to include. So there's, of course, certain, like the policy cost and the merits, these are country-specific, but these are principles for all countries. Rather, I cannot have, considering all the individual circumstances in every country, which now are still in these pledges, included. But in the end, we will need an acceptance, the compromise for the acceptance of an agreement. We will need mechanisms for raising the ambitions. And as a last slide, I would have an idea how these ambitions could be raised, because this will be the major task in the coming 10 days. How can we increase the ambitions of the world community and get a final agreement done? So this is a visualization how these ambitions could become more dynamic and then also stay dynamic. Thank you. So on the left-hand side, you have what's happening now. This is the first lane is you have these national efficiency targets. You have the I indices. This gives the contributions of the different countries. And now they have kind of internal incentives already. This already broadly implemented in the text. Countries should always become more and more ambitious over their previous commitments. So this is what I call an internal incentive. See what you have done so far, could you not do more? And then, of course, if you think, well, it's doable to get more, we have now green technologies, we have kind of a good strategy, we can be more ambitious. So this is what I have on the left side. But I think that's not sufficient. And actually, this is already, this will be somehow feasible, because every country will still say, well, I can do a little bit better than last time. But this is not really what I call equitable burden sharing. So necessarily, I think we should also look at the right-hand side. So these were my equity guidelines. Whether you now say a uniform global carbon tax or egalitarian access to carbon space or something in between, a compromise is what I'm really having in mind. We need these fairness incentives. One has to check these calculators, one has to compare the I indices, one has to make sure that the different parties are more or less involved in a common but differentiated manner. And this is what this carbon calculator can do, and it is for every country, of course, an incentive to see how far they are in their own ambitions. And I think we have, on the one hand side, we have the bottom-up, we have some kind of a top-down or a more sophisticated bottom-up, and it should be together. So there should be a procedure which is like, I don't know, it goes like a current system which goes back and forth. We cannot only have top-down, we cannot have only bottom-up. I think only together there will be an efficient and an equitable agreement in the end. And with this, I thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucas. Do you want to stay there for
Yes.
1 minute, if you wouldn't mind, or actually
Yes, sure.
about 7 minutes? Do we have some questions? Well, I have a question if we didn't. But gentleman there, yes, please. Do please introduce yourself.
I'm Antti Asekainen from the Natural Resources Finland. You mentioned these two approaches, top-down and bottom-up. And from the energy investments perspective, to transform the global energy system, which one do you see more efficient? Or which one is promoting the investments in the new energy system?
I think from the perspective of efficiency, it's clear. It's the top-down one, because you have really you have uniform prices, you have uniform ambitions. You can reach most for the renewables and for energy-efficient solutions if you do it top-down. Unfortunately, and this is always like in national environmental policies, you have not sufficient support for these policies. So all these equity and distribution issues come in to make an efficient solution possible and feasible. And maybe we have to do a compromise, and that's why I say, well, we have to check first what the individuals or the countries are willing to contribute. So we have to rely on this bottom-up, and actually it has happened in the first phase of this COP now. But now, secondly, we really have to make it much more efficient, and this will be what we call the top-down. But in fact, we also have to agree. I mean, if you say we do a uniform carbon price or we do the equity-based approach, it would also be bottom-up. You have fewer parameters. Instead of every country having some kind of an idea what they could do, you have some metric which is universal, applicable to all, and this is what I also understand on CBDR. So I think what's going on now is not CBDR, it's not efficient, it's not equitable, so we have to improve on that, and this is why some top-down elements can be very useful. But as you know, the decision process at United Nations, I mean, is such that we really have to be very, very careful and to have very much this bottom-up approach included. When it came up several years ago, I was very much not in favor of it, and now I have seen how badly needed it is just to get parties involved and to have them doing something at all. But in fact, I would really say we have to do a second lane, we have to do this top-down, we have to do these equity guidelines, and we have to have this fairness in burden sharing.
Thank you. Do we have, yes, gentleman here.
I'm Anders Hansen. I'm a consultant working for the Norwegian Institute for Bioeconomic or Research on the Bioeconomy. And I would just like to get clarified what exactly you mean about the tax. Where does the revenue go? Does it stay in the country, in the public government budget of the country, or does it go somewhere else? I think it's very important when you discuss equity.
You're perfectly right. When I talk about this here, I was too short on this. Maybe I was missing a bit the introduction. So the idea here with this uniform carbon price is that the tax revenue stays within the country. So this is the most extreme form. And you could probably, if I go back, I can probably not go back with the slides, you can also have taxes being collected on a national level and then redistribution with taxes, bonus-malus system. That's also feasible. But the difference being, in my view, if you allocate carbon budgets and then you say, okay, this is the quantity you can use, and then you see with your national environmental policy how you're going to do this, you give something from the international community to the countries as a gift. So this is what you get for free. Arrangez-vous. And the other one is when you make the single countries collect taxes, they would consider these tax revenues for themselves. Especially the United States would say that this is our taxes if you're not going to hand out to everybody and to anybody. So this is really what's staying within the country. So that's the most extreme form. This is why I have the straight line. The higher is the emission per capita, the higher is the tax revenue, and the higher is the carbon share that you're allocating to your own country. But in fact, you could do also the carbon pricing and then have some redistribution scheme. It would be feasible as well, and you could do such an extreme redistribution that you actually would go back to the Indian proposal. You could say there is an average per capita emission, and everything who is over the average will be redistributed internationally. Then you would have a very egalitarian view. So everything is possible with both instruments. It was just my approach to say, well, in my case, the extreme form is that you have a carbon tax, but the whole tax revenue remains within the country. And of course, a very poor and then low polluting country will have a very low carbon budget, naturally. And this is the equity, which not everybody would see. This is the equity implication of that whole thing.
Okay, I think we've just about exhausted Lucas's time. I'll throw in one quick last question about politics, if I may, because it seems to me that the great accomplishment of this model is also its obvious weakness. It's a sort of algorithm that maps huge political uncertainty an area for negotiation and puts it all together rather than a way through those difficulties. The historic contributions, national voluntary targets, all of this is contained in the model, but all of these are areas for future arguments and discussion. So my question is in two parts. One, do you see this actually as a model for cost sharing, or is it a tool to help the negotiation? And secondly, who's most interested in this? Is it rich countries? Is it poor countries? Who considers themselves to be the likeliest winners from this?
Okay, two very good questions. So first of all, I mean, I think it should support negotiations. As I started, and maybe also this was a bit difficult because of circumstances, I said we have a pragmatic view and we have an ideal view, and both of them are relevant. And the calculator, this strict, say, this pattern that we're giving here, that we're calculating, is kind of an ideal. If you had the task to have equitable burden sharing, you would do it you would like to do it in an ideal way, you would do it like this. But reality is never like this, of course. This is why I say we have this individual contributions of the countries, and we have the ideal, we have the metric, and now we try to bring these two worlds closer together. That would help the negotiating process. On the other hand, you say, who is most in favor of one or the other? I showed you that for the egalitarian access to carbon space, this is in favor of the poorer countries, those who have started with the emissions later. And the tax solution is proposed by the United States, for example, for some professors from Harvard. This is, of course, favoring the higher pollution and the higher developed countries. And one of the possibilities, if you have these four equity principles, if you have equal weights, then you get something which is kind of in between. So you give the poor countries more than you would give with the tax, you give the richer countries a bit less than you would give with the tax. So you can have it either way. So I see that's kind of a medium position, but in fact, in the end, what it makes visible is really that we have a deep problem to solve, and we also, I mean, this was written in the New York Times yesterday, it really makes clear how inequitable the world at the moment is. And this some people don't like to see, so they say, okay, we dismiss the carbon budget, we dismiss the carbon price, we just think about all these details and then nobody will realize. But in the end, if you want to reach the 2 degrees Celsius target, there is no way that you do not observe this carbon budget. There's no other way. And you say it's a bit depressing just to have a cake and to see how much you can eat of this cake. But the optimistic view that we should probably tell people is that many other cakes. This is the carbon cake. Of course, this we have to share and we have to limit ourselves. But there's many other cakes to eat. So let's move forward. And it's not so depressing. We have many alternatives. And this is why we should be cautiously optimistic.
Thank you very much indeed.